to turn it over to Dr. Sayida Peprah.
Thank you so much. I am just opening up my screen. Are you still able to see me?
We sure can. Welcome. You look gorgeous.
Perfect. Thank you. When I was asked to do this this conversation and this talk, I thought, where do we start with the question of and the conversation about Black motherhood in the US? And one of the grounding principles that has really guided me in my personal life and my spiritual life in the work that I do, even with clients as a psychologist, and as a birth doula, working with families trying to achieve the optimal birth experience. History, the background, how we got to where we are in this moment is very important to help understand where we're actually at versus where we might imagine we are, or where we hope we'll be, or where we think we are. And so there's a concept in the West African tradition, the Akan people, called Sankofa. And it means that in order to go forward, to be powerful, to lead, you have to actually look back to the history. And so we're going to do a bit of that to understand. And this is not all of the experience of Black motherhood in the US, but certainly it gives us a context. And I felt like it was very timely at the moment we're in. I wanted to kind of start with, my lived experience in the conversation is definitely related to what I'll talk about and what impacts why this is so important to me. I'm a Black woman. I have two Black daughters. Both of my girls have been affected even before they were born in various ways related to the impact of historical trauma, implicit biases that I would have received in maternal care, and even in their elementary years and in their, obviously in the current time with the news, but they have experienced this discrepancy between who they present as and who the world sees them as. And I think that's very important to consider that the Black mother's experience also is the experience of Black women in general, and that it really doesn't just happen in motherhood, but it starts as a child as well. My girls are now much bigger, and the other aspect that informs the way that I think about this is that I spend a lot of time teaching courses, both to large audiences like at conferences, but also in small community gatherings in the Black community, in communities of color, and in sort of mixed crowds as well. And when I listen to the stories of Black women, it tells me something very specific and very clear about people's experiences, both positive and also those that are challenging. And so I'll bring some of those into the conversation today as well. So let's go back, sort of like, where did Black motherhood in the US start, right? And so we as a people did not start in America as enslaved people. We started in Africa and had rich cultures and heritage and family systems and lineages. But that was stolen from the community at large, and certainly the experience in particular to mothers, that the community was, person by person, group by group, kidnapped from the continent and brought to the United States and enslaved. And that process in and of itself was quite a trauma. And if you have known anything, watched any movies, seen any the literature and information about the transatlantic slave trade and the process of bringing people to the States and to the Caribbean and to other places in the world, it was a very traumatizing experience. And one of the things that I think about as I think of my ancestors when I was in Ghana at the slave castles, I spent time really, just tuning into the experience of my ancestors and those that have traveled through that passage, the door of no return, and the place where they would remove people from the slave castles, as they call them, into the ships and send them throughout the world, that there were pregnant women in that experience, that there were people, obviously the women, many of them being mothers, that their children were there, some of them had been taken from their children, and that people were raped even in the process and gave birth to children that came out of that level of violence and brought them into the new world. And so just to be conscious of the fact that even in the initiation of the coming to the United States, there was a really strong attack on the Black mother, because one of the things that happened after the Middle Passage and the time where people were transported throughout the world from Africa is that it was banned eventually. It was seen to be this terrible thing, and so, which it was. And so what America did, very different than other places, is really center the breeding of enslaved people and the reinforcement to maintain the wealth of the nation. And so it shifted from bringing people, which was already horrific, to forcing Black women to give birth to the next generation of enslaved children and adults and people. And again, like really having a context for the attack on the Black mother. Some of the other aspects, obviously, of being enslaved is that it's dehumanizing, it's violent, there were beatings, people were disfigured, individuals were raped. There was this like forced quote unquote mating between other enslaved community members. And also, obviously, we know historically, lots of slave masters were forcing themselves upon those that were, under their, under captivity. And that was, a huge part of the culture of American slavery. Wet nursing actually is something that a lot of people don't realize, that that the Black women, not just those that were enslaved, but even those after, spent many years being wet nurses for white families, obviously in bondage. They were forced to do this. If you have breast milk, as we all know, that means you had a baby. And so where's your baby in the course of you giving milk to these white families? And this was pervasive throughout the lineage of slavery, that Black women were forced to take care of white children. And it actually became one of the viable employments after slavery ended. So maintaining sort of that servitude to other families, but denying your family your maternal experience, your breastfeeding, and having to really survive, juxtapose your family. Obviously, the stealing of children was an active part of slavery. And so one of the experiences for Black motherhood is, a concern around the safety and the autonomy of your children, right? And so being able to know that they're yours, they belong to you, that no one can take them away from you. And this is something that we hear even in focus groups now. Obviously, this is a historical situation, but when we think of Child Protective Services and other and incarceration of young people and young Black and brown children, we definitely see that there's been a pervasive sort of cultural lineage in the Black community around the lack of safety of children and the concern that the state, the government, the forces that be, the powers that be, have the power to take your children from you. And this is something in the maternal health world that really becomes a problem when we look at the level of trust or lack of trust that communities have, but also the way that we create policies that can inherently disenfranchise Black mothers when we have a system that's biased in this way, where there's a question about the whether or not Black women are positive parents. Now, obviously, it's a general stereotype, and not everybody believes that. But there is in social work, there is in mental health world, there is in the medical field this idea that the Black mother, in and of herself, because she's Black, not because of racism, not because of the history, is an unfit mother. There's this legacy of these ideas that have been perpetuated, and so we see that Black children, even though they're not the majority of the children in the nation, are the highest number of children that are removed from families' homes. And so lots of these are still sort of like pervasive historical traumas, but really need to be understood in the context of today. I always want to note that we have, our fellow, brothers and sisters that were with us being colonized and going through their own levels of genocide and oppression from the same, oppressive force. Our Indigenous families, my family is of Indigenous heritage as well. And I never forget the mothers of the Indigenous families that also have experienced a similar situation, where we have the forced removal from lands, we have children being taken to boarding houses and boarding schools, forced marriages. A lot of people don't know, if you study the history of sort of the policy in the US around managing the Indigenous people, that there was this idea at a certain time that, if we can't sort of force them out of their culture, and boarding schools isn't enough, if we breed it out of them, if we force people to marry into, and particularly Indigenous women, to marry white men, then the children will perpetually be lighter, and that you would breed out the Indian. And this was like the terminology and the way that it was used. And so what I think is significant about that is when we start looking at the impacts of this sort of historical legacy on maternal health, we really see connections, and Indigenous people and African Americans have very similar statistics around maternal health, but we'll get to that. So some of the things that I think are really important for us to remember as well is how harmful and traumatic the medical and official sort of like health services for this country have been against Black people and other people of color. We had experimental gynecological surgeries conducted on enslaved women, where they were purchased for the purpose of conducting surgeries to try to find the cure of fistulas and all kinds of things to understand the female anatomy. And what I think is interesting, and for those of us that know sort of this idea that people now, have perpetuated in the medical world, but also just sort of this idea that it's inaccurate, that Black women don't feel pain in the same way. One of the historical legacies of that is actually this idea that they actually started with these experimental surgeries and trying to examine the women's anatomy with white women. And they were considered to be too frail and too fragile. And they would cry and they would scream and they would, become ill, as of course a person that is being tortured would. And what's interesting about the experience that they had in their minds around Black women is that they were able to take pain differently. And the concept of this as a psychologist is like, it's so problematic, because you'd have to understand that if a person is a human and they have a nervous system, they could feel pain the same. Like, this is a scientific reality that people may have variations of how pain is felt, but there isn't a racial variation in how people feel pain. But there is a psychological one, because if you've experienced high levels of torture, high levels of physical pain, your endurance mentally, what you think you can contain, and also the threat of your life, that if you don't do what you're asked to do, if you don't find a way to make it better for someone that they're torturing you. And I don't know the experiences personally of the women, and who obviously went through this horrific experience, but having worked with people as a psychologist who've experienced trauma and rape and torture, and listening to their stories and understanding what happens to the individual, it's very sad that the interpretation would be that somehow that it was easier and better and less harmful for it to be done on people who were already experiencing so much trauma and oppression. We also had a third of the population in Puerto Rico that was intentionally sterilized under government strategy, which a lot of people aren't aware of. Indigenous communities also had lengths of intentional sterilizations to their communities as well. In the Mexican community in particular, in Los Angeles, there have been a lot of opportunity to learn about, well, not a lot, but a significant amount in recent years, some of the intentional sterilizations done in hospitals, and particularly in Los Angeles. No Mas Bayvis, I always recommend that people watch that for a couple of reasons. It gives you empathy for anybody who's ever experienced forced sterilization of their community or in individuals and families, the personal experience, because there are personal accounts there as well, but also to just really understand, the layouts, I think politically, structurally, and conceptually, how this could be something that is very real in many people who might be listening to this call in their lifetime. And, and also obviously, one of the concerns I think that continues to be an issue is how hormones are tested, how birth control and different medical interventions are tested, and who they're sort of trialed on. And we have historically had them being tried on poor and Black and brown communities. And that's also problematic, because you then have people who've had bad side effects and problematic reactions that I think it makes it difficult for people to understand why there's so much distrust. Only if you know the history and you know the information, you don't find that to be confusing. These next image, I'm giving a trigger warning, are a bit graphic, but I think important to understand sort of what the lengths of the experience is, especially because in the community, these are images and concepts that we experience. I think now, this is something I've been talking about for years. But now with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many conversations, Ahmaud Arbery, about, and everyone that has been killed publicly or the information about it has become public, that the impact of that for the individual is really intense. And so the community has experienced this for a long time. So one of the things, obviously, that we have to remember is that we didn't just have enslavement that ended. We also had, systematic, ongoing, institutionalized racism, which we all recognize is still in effect in many ways. We had Jim Crow. We've had police brutality that's had its different ways in the 60s, and we had the KKK, and many of whom were formal enlisted police and sheriffs. And so there is this connection also between the systematic and the individual and the vigilante. We had public hangings of Black women, and we had beatings, not just of men, which we see a lot more, but also of women. And the way that women have been treated in the United States, even now, is abhorrible. And it's something that people don't know a lot about, that it's not just men that were attacked and have been targeted in this way. So a little bit about the historical trauma impacts, in particular on maternal health. And there's lots to get into, and I go into this at length in other topics, but I just want to kind of touch on it briefly. The impact of stress on the body, perpetual stress, is one of the silent killers and dangers of health in general for all people, not just Black people, not just brown people, not just poor people, but for anyone. If you have chronic stress, it is something that if you get an immune disorder, if you have cancer, if you have some kind of situation, one of the first things they'll ask you is, well, what do we do to reduce your stress? Because it has such a high level of impact. It impacts the immune system. It impacts digestive system, the cardiovascular system, your heart, the musculoskeletal system, your ability to, whether or not you have migraines, whether or not you have extreme and constant tension in your neck and in your back, the reproductive system, fibroids, internal reproductive challenges are also linked and connected to chronic stress, and the endocrine system, your skin, rashes, hives. One of the things that, if you look at the disparities in the Black community and other communities of color and other communities that have chronic stress as a part of their life, and I'm saying this to say that racial stress, race-related microstressors are aspects of chronic stress, that what we see is that it has the effect somewhat generationally, which is a whole nother topic on epigenetics, but also individually to lower your ability to reduce your stress, because over time that system sort of gets shot out and you cannot as easily regain composure and calm. And so you see higher blood pressure. Sometimes in studies they've done where they'll compare the resting, sort of like get somebody to rev up their blood pressure, have a team of Black women, and then comparing them with other women, and seeing that in many cases, the Black women's blood pressure doesn't lower at the same rate, and it doesn't go back to a resting in the same pattern. And it's like, well, what is that? Is that biological? Well, no, because we're not, a genetically homogeneous group. But that is a shared experience, potentially, that there is so much chronic stress in the life of Black women that it has this level of impact, and we know that it does. We probably know many of the maternal health disparities, but given that I mentioned those various aspects, I want you to sort of see how they come into play. So we have mortality, and particularly the maternal mortality is related to, now on the physiological side, but also we're going to talk about the racism side as well. Vulnerability of strokes, which is something that we also see is higher in Black communities. And so we have this melding of chronic stress and the impact of racism and chronic race-related microstressors, compounding with implicit bias and racism and systems that are not necessarily set up in a way that is supportive and healing and culturally congruent and culturally enforcing and affirming, where people don't necessarily feel welcomed, where doctors and physicians and nurses and maybe doulas and midwives and various people are not able, willing, understanding to be able to listen to and hear the needs, to attend to them, to understand how significant they are, that there is a value system placed on certain communities. I was at one hospital and they had mentioned that they had one wing for Medicaid clients, it wasn't in California, and another one for paid insurance. And I just thought, oh, what a house ready for racism and implicit bias. Because if you know that those people over there, and then you fill in the stereotypes, and then those people over there, I mean, you can imagine the reality of how this country is, how people can treat people differently. And so we have a very strong concern around maternal mortality and the way that this interplays. And all of this really connected to the impacts of racism and oppression. Obviously, C-section rates are high. And, we also have perinatal mood disorders that are also high. Breastfeeding, which we talked about a bit of the history of breastfeeding, and you can imagine for a community that's had such active hostility, active oppression of independent, autonomous motherhood, the opportunity for generations to be able to feed your baby as your baby needs it, to be able to have your children and to nurture them. And then, of course, the poverty aspect and the need to find a way to survive in a world that's hostile toward your community requires you to work, to get education, to do things that take you outside of the home. So the Black mother, unlike some other mothers in America, have had generations where they are a working mother, and they're oftentimes outside of the home, which then also impacts the ability and the rate of the capacity to breastfeed. So then you have generations of community that haven't breastfed or have it spotty here and there, pervasive stereotypes and ideas around it. And then you have sort of this environment where it is that we have the lowest rate of initiation of breastfeeding. But I will say that I really, truly believe this, and I will, check back in 10 years, that we will be the fastest growing breastfeeding community in the nation. Because the shift in the consciousness of the Black community and the way that we are on platforms like this, able to sort of explain to the mass world that is actually receiving us and caring for us, is coming to understand some of the things that are really important and significant and why they impact the community, and why there is a level of a need for a high level of cultural congruence and care and humility and the support of the Black community. I want to end talking about resilience. In spite of all of this, we are still alive. We are still here. We still care for our children. We still care for our community. The Black mother, the Black woman is, of course, I'm biased as a Black woman, one of the strongest mothers and communities of women in this nation. And I'll say that because as a shared community, to go through 400 years plus of active, intentional suppression of your beingness, and to still be able to bring powerful images to reinforce things that we know we want to uplift in our community, to have active Black organizations, documentaries, the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, a forming of Black women-led organizations all over the country. It's incredible. If you look at Black Mamas Matter Alliance, the kindred partners are all over this country. And they didn't just start with Black Mamas Matter Alliance. We existed, Black Women Birth and Justice, all of us have existed. And we have been doing this work in our communities despite all the difficulty. We're like always thinking forward. We're very, we have a level of fortitude that it really takes you to understand our history, to understand how much it is. And so I really wanted people to be sort of thinking about, the power of that. The culture of resilience is pervasive as a key component of Black motherhood. And this is a quote that I love of Harriet Tubman. If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop, keep going. If you want the taste of freedom, keep going. And I think that this really captures the spirit of Black motherhood. The last thing on what you can do, this is for Black mothers and families. There is an excerpt that Black Women Birth and Justice put out, a statement on how we're feeling as Black women. And the one thing that I'll read about this, and you can look on the website, the full document is there, that however we're feeling, whatever we need to do to take care of ourselves right now, all of it's valid. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to grieve. It's okay not to engage with white friends on social media, at your job, or wherever it is, where it's, especially at this time, it's very painful because a lot of people are looking to Black people to do something. And we're like currently experiencing high levels of emotion, and a lot of people are highly triggered and feeling trauma. And that's a lot to ask of individuals. even in positions of leadership, to step up to do something when they are sort of, in this case, the victim of what is happening. That it's okay to be okay with things burning down. It's okay to not go out. It's okay to stay home. It's okay to take care of your family. It's okay to take care of yourself. It's okay to feel, to do whatever you feel you need to do. And for the broader community, to engage actively in dismantling implicit bias for yourself, for your community, and your institutions, studying social justice, human rights, anti-racism, social determinants. Like, this history cannot just be known by the community. It needs to be known by everyone so that we can understand how important it is for us to shift things. Recognizing and acknowledging Black women's contributions and struggles, I think is, when I see a Black woman struggling, as a psychologist, I'm going in and I'm working with someone, right away I am reinforcing how strong she is to even be in front of me, and what she might have gone through and what her ancestors might have gone through and how it might have impacted her. And so I'm going to the strength of the suffering and not to the pity of the suffering. And I think it's very important to center the power that is there, even when people are experiencing a struggle. How much it's taken for them to just be there is something that they actually have, and it's a resilience within. And again, to support your local Black women-led organizations. Black Mamas Matter Alliance is just a start for you to see where people are all over the community. And so if you go on the website, you can look and you can find all the organizations that are existing all over the country and support them. If they're in your area, see if they need anything. And obviously financial support and logistic support and supporting policies and agendas and what the community says they need. That's what I recommend that everybody support. Thank you so much.